whenever he steps into a race, whenever he steps into the ring, he really can change the political dynamic so quickly.
You have one of the biggest tests for this president with the upcoming midterms in November.
The challenge for President Trump is that he has kind of a ticking clock with regards to those midterms.
Hey guys, buenos dias. Great to see you both. We have, of course, myself and Bernd and one of our favorite guests, Finn Gomez, a political director at CBS News. We should also say, Finn, you're the senior executive director of White House coverage at CBS as well. Great to see you again.
Great to see you, and buenos dias.
Well, it feels like for several weeks now we've been talking about the war in Iran, and Finn, and you know this as well, obviously, that we keep kind of circling back to some of the same topics and some of the same messaging from President Trump. And this is going to be another week where we do that because we've heard President Trump again say we've won the war. We even heard the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say that Operation Epic Fury is over. And yet this limbo period in terms of negotiations continues.
Absolutely. And I think it's a great frustration to many within the White House, as well as those allies close to the president. It all goes back really to that massive leverage point that Iran has with the Straits of Hormuz. And I think that's something that, they are, that's like the massive block here for them trying to get a solution. It is something that's been impacting him not only externally but also at home, Sumi. And you've been seeing that in some of the latest polling. He's somewhere the approval rating somewhere along in the low 30s, in the 30s, and he's got gas prices are over 4.50 a gallon here in the United States, and and there's also been an opposition to the war. It's a very unpopular war. We've seen that in the latest polls, not only from CBS but from other outlets like CNN and others. That as this continues to drag on past that 2-month period, it continues to be a weight that's been sort of holding down the domestic perspective, at least, of this administration.
And I think also, detractors of the president will point to this last week and paint kind of a picture of dysfunction. They're really, even more so than in other cases in this administration, kind of a sense of whiplash in that Operation or Project Freedom, rather, the effort to open up the Strait of Hormuz. High-level officials, Secretary Hegseth, Marco Rubio, had spent an entire day kind of laying out what the plan was. And then that very same evening, President Trump really suddenly hit the brakes on Project Freedom and said it was paused to allow for negotiations. I think, no matter what the administration just does to kind of justify that, people who are against the war in Iran, whether they be Democrats or some of the Republicans that have spoken out against kind of the extended conflict, are going to point to that and say, is there a plan here? Because this doesn't necessarily seem like one.
That doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't, some real steps forward happening in terms of negotiations. We don't have a real view into that. We're not privy, of course, to those conversations. But from what we're hearing from our colleagues at BBC Persian and from our colleagues who are covering the Middle East as well, it could be that the Iranians are indeed behind closed doors signaling to President Trump that they do want to make a deal. This is what President Trump says time and again. He says this pretty much every day, that the Iranians want to make a deal. And it's just a question of when they do it. But every time I speak to an Iran analyst, these key sticking points of would Iran give up its enriched uranium, which President Trump claims that the U.S. will get that uranium. Will Iran agree to never enrich uranium again? Would there be some sort of sunset clause on this? We've talked about this on the pod in the past. All of these points they see as very unlikely that Iran would give ground on this. That had me wondering if, with President Trump, if that might even be an impediment for him to reach an agreement with Iran, knowing that he is so conscious of not wanting any of his detractors to be able to say, well, the deal that President Obama got in the JCPOA was better or at least equal. He wants to be able to say, I got a better deal. Will the Iranians give ground on that? It's really not clear.
The president for years for years has lambasted the JCPOA under Obama. Back in 2024, I mean, this is a central part of his contrasting message when it came to foreign policy, and he absolutely ravaged that. So any comparisons, or any comparisons where you actually may perhaps elevate this, it definitely does complicate the exit strategy here for the president and the administration. I would like to add that even though his polls have sagged over this overall nationally, pretty much when you look at his base, if you look at the Republican Party, he still has a very strong support coming from the GOP, and I think that is going to. I think he's going to withhold that. But again, like looking a little bit ahead, and a few months ahead of time, you have one of the biggest tests for this president with the upcoming midterms in November.
I think the challenge for President Trump is that he has kind of a ticking clock with regards to those midterms. The longer that gas prices stay elevated and people feel that he is in some way responsible for that, and polls suggest that many people do think he's personally responsible for bringing the gas prices up in the $4 or $5 a gallon range in the States, was not, of course, very challenging for a lot of people. The longer that is the case, I think the more challenging his messaging that this is an excursion, as he calls it, that this is a short-term kind of trade-off for Iran not having a nuclear weapon that he's willing to make. That becomes much more challenging. The other part of that is the Iranians also, though, have a ticking time clock. The longer the blockade goes on, the harder their economy takes it. Food, for example, there might be kind of internal dissent just based on food prices alone. So it's interesting to see, there's those two kind of clocks ticking at the same time. And I think really it just becomes then a question of who blinks first.
Well, this is the point that I keep hearing from analysts is, this is a question indeed of who blinks first, but the Iranians are an oppressive theocracy and they are able to withstand that pain longer because they are not as beholden in the same way to that public pressure that President Trump might be. President Trump and his administration have a very different picture than Congress when it comes to whether he needs Congress's approval to greenlight his war efforts in Iran. Of course, that 60-day period came and went after which the president would have had to get approval from Congress. And we've seen some pretty creative interpretations from the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, from the president himself saying, well, I don't need that approval. And, we are in a ceasefire right now, so it's not necessary. You're going to start to see that argument also frustrate Republicans in Congress. And I wonder if that will add to some of those time pressures that President Trump is facing.
Looking at these poll numbers, and the longer this goes on, and some analysts, as has been mentioned, have said that gas prices, regardless of sort of the outcome here, the immediate outcome, if there is one, gas prices still will likely remain high for months and through potentially the election in November. Remember, affordability was the key issue. It was a mantra for the president back in 2024. It's a big reason why he won in 2024, and going into his first year of his administration, the low gas prices that we initially saw before the Iran war, that was something that the president and his allies touted, as one of their biggest accomplishments, if you will. That has been negated because of this. And most Americans, they don't really truly care about what's happening in Iran specifically or comparatively to what they really care about, and that's the cost of living issues that has been so pronounced. And so as this continues on, it's what matters at home. It's the pocketbook issues. It's those issues that affects their families and their wallets. And that's how, by any measure, if you look at it cycle after cycle, that is a major reason why people vote. And I think that going into this midterms, that is something that could be a bit of a political buzzsaw for Republicans, especially congressional Republicans who are already facing historic headwinds in these midterms, that they could potentially lose more seats than it has been predicted or expected.
And they're just looking at the polling, there's kind of a pretty significant enthusiasm gap between Democrats and Republicans at the moment. I was just looking at one poll shortly before we jumped on that showed that more than 70% of Democrats polled by the CNN poll think that the midterms are extremely important and that they need to get out there. That number is kind of in the 50s among Republicans, which is a huge problem that also compounds in, a lot of the groups that are kind of considered swing voters. Latino voters, for example, probably the biggest swing vote in the United States. They care about those prices and the economy much more than any other issue. So I think the enthusiasm gap plus those swing voters potentially blaming Republicans and the administration for those prices, that's kind of a very perfect storm that they'll have to deal with.
100%. I would just want to add, it's swing voters, it's Latino voters, as you said, Hispanics. Almost half of Hispanics supported the president in 2024. Over 50% of Hispanic males supported the president in 2024. Some historic numbers there by any Republican president, and it's independent voters, it's young voters. Really key components of that Trump 2024 coalition are starting to bleed away from Republican support in this midterm cycle. It's always tough for the party that controls the White House in any midterm for the most part. There's been like 2 incidents in like two cycles in the last like 40 years where it's gone against that trend. But this cycle, it does appear that at least at this point, with 180 days out or whatever it might be approximately, that you are seeing significant impact by the ongoing Iran situation and others that are leaving Republicans nervous about their outcome come November.
Quickly on that point, I think it's really notable that President Trump openly acknowledges that these midterms might not go the same way. I mean, it's something he says quite often, that he doesn't understand why, but the midterms always go bad for the party in power. It's really rare for him in general to say publicly that he thinks something could go wrong or something has gone wrong, or kind of open up that possibility. His public statements are very consistent and very confident. So to actually hear him say that in the Oval Office, essentially every time he's asked about it, I think shows just kind of the scope of the problem for President Trump to come out and publicly acknowledge that this might not go the way he wants it to. That's not something we hear from him very often at all.
Yeah, and there is a bit of that tension, isn't there, between the White House understanding the messaging that President Trump might need to deliver and the message he's actually delivering. And it was so interesting to, again, hear him at the White House say, well, gas, I thought we're going to see $200 a barrel for oil. And so gas prices are not as high as they could be. We thought the stock market would be way down. Well, it's up. And so things are far better off than we thought. And once again, this is, very similar to what we saw President Biden struggle with as he was heading into the campaign before he dropped out, of course, that the economy was not matching, or that the reality of the economy was not matching those macroeconomic figures that he was looking at. But we are now under that 6-month mark to the midterms. And I thought there was some interesting kind of both primaries and early tests that we can look at, because until now, all of the special elections that have taken place since President Trump took office again for the second time have really swung towards the Democrats, at a lot of Republicans sounding the alarm, a lot of Democrats feeling very, very positive about their chances. But there was this big these big primary races in Indiana, and I'm the one who always brings up Indiana as one of those big political defeats for President Trump in December, when a number of Republicans in the state legislature there decided to vote against redistricting. President Trump wanted them to redraw congressional maps. They said no. And that was a pretty surprising rebuke. Well, President Trump and his team and the MAGA coalition poured millions of dollars into races to challenge, with MAGA candidates, to challenge those senators who had kind of turned their back on him. And 5 of those candidates won. And that was seen as a pretty big victory. And for some people as well, a sign that President Trump still wields incredible power, when he is focused in a race like that.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I would just weigh in, like, I think that, what happened in Indiana, where 7 out of those 7 Indiana state senators who were on the ballot, who dare to defy President Trump back in December against his redistricting efforts in the state, in the Hoosier state. That, you know, out of those 7, at least 5 have lost, and potentially it could be 6. And the thing is, you know, it was a big win for the president. It was a big win for his political operation. And again, it showed, like you said, that he has this enormous amount of sway still within the primaries and within the party. And even though his polls again might not be maybe sagging nationally and with other groups, with Republicans, he's still you know, he still holds a lot of sway. He's still you know, very, very strongly popular with them. So I think that is notable. It was a sort of a line, is basically saying, dared to defy me to other Republicans, dared to defy me on these crucial votes or issues that I want to, you know, implement. It's a political threat. I could primary you. I could win those primaries, and I could be, you know. And so I think that it was a sort of a ringing of a bell for other potential Republicans who may want to, you know, veer away from that. I do think, and then, you know, following that Supreme Court ruling from, you know, the recent Supreme Court ruling, you also have seen on the Voting Rights Act. It's basically allowed for more of these redistricting efforts in the southern states that are led by Republicans. So you're already seeing what this does and what this could do with Indiana, with like some of his other redistricting wins, and now with what's happening in the South, he could net more Republican-friendly seats, and that could stave off some of those, you know, offset some of those expected losses in November. However, it may not matter, because we may have this wave election that could overcome any sort of gains they've made on those redistricting efforts.
There's also a practical issue here for President Trump, and that once you're in the White House, being in campaign mode is much more difficult. There's just the realities of the job just mean, you know, it won't be the same as the campaign. And early on this year, the Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, said that they were going to try to get him out there much more often, once a week, to speak to voters. And we really only have kind of begun to see that, but I don't think it's really been at the same pace as I think many people were expected. Of course, he might ramp that up, but like I said, there's other issues at hand when you're the president. You know, I think it's notable that now, when he's actually been out there speaking to people. I was at an event with him in Florida recently. He was talking about no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security. So you're seeing kind of that economic message kind of shift to where he very much sees wins. No tax on tips thing in particular, I think he sees that as something that they can kind of bank on as a positive message for voters in the near term.
And I have talked to some top advisors in his political operation who said essentially that's their focus, is like, you know, they're going to get these big tax rebates roughly around now. People are going to get their money back. They're going to feel better about the economy. That was their initial sort of strategy. And of course, again, the Iran war and rising gas prices complicates that. But there's also an expectation that overall the strategy, they're going to have to get more negative on their Democratic foes. And I think you see a lot more negative ads, a lot more critical ads, contrast ads, whatever you want to call them, in this next period of the election cycle and through the fall.
You know what I'm going to be really interested to watch as well, is the primary in Kentucky, where Congressman Thomas Massie is being primaried by a candidate supported by President Trump. And remember, Thomas Massie has been a big thorn in President Trump's side, hasn't he, when it comes to first the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and then with the Epstein files, pushing for the release of the Epstein files. And he's kind of carved out such an interesting space in being able to, he says 90% of the time I vote with the Republicans and President Trump, but I also have my own ideas. I stand up for what I believe in. And he has stood fast to that, even though he's been under massive pressure from President Trump. He's a popular congressman in his district. And so I wonder, with that full court press, if we can call it that, that President Trump and the MAGA coalition put on in Indiana, they're doing the same in Kentucky. And I wonder if that works, that is again a sign that when President Trump is engaged fully, when the MAGA coalition is, pulling out all the stops, let's say, to make sure that they win a race, they could do that in November, and that could have a massive impact on the results of these races, especially when you have such gerrymandered districts that the ability for Democrats to really pick up that many more seats is pretty limited.
Great reference to Massey, because I think Massey's, and they've following Indiana, they have that's what they're setting their sights on now. This Trump political organization. I think Chris LaCivita, a top leader of the Trump political organization, his former co-campaign manager in 2024. He put on social, to Massey, "You're next," following the Indiana successes they had. Look, they poured a ton of money, super PAC money. It's just a lot of money has been put into Massey's district, and to help his primary challenger, who was endorsed by President Trump, obviously. But following Indiana, I think in terms of that success they had there, I would be a little nervous if I was Congressman Massey, because they succeeded well when it was predicted that in this Hoosier state, the land of Mike Pence, they would be able to maybe survive some of this. Look, I think it's going to be a battle in Kentucky for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should say that for Democrats, they are feeling pretty positive about their prospects heading into the midterms, but they're aware that President Trump is the ultimate wild card, isn't he? Whenever he steps into a race, whenever he steps into the ring, he really can change the political dynamics so quickly. That's one. And as I keep saying over and over, it's so important to remember, just because President Trump in this war, for example, that they are unpopular, that doesn't mean the Democrats are popular. Their overall brand remains, pretty unpopular. There are specific candidates who have performed very well in districts or in states, for example, Mikey Sherrill, and when we look at the gubernatorial races and the special elections, Mikey Sherrill and Abigail Spanberger, so New Jersey and Virginia, respectively. But that being said, they have to make sure that they are fielding candidates who can overcome, let's say, the somewhat negative association with the overall Democrats brand.
I kind of think that's been the unspoken thing since people started talking about the midterms. People. It seems to me in a lot of the U.S. media outlets, a lot of commentators talk about how there's a segment of the Republican Party and the MAGA base that's dissatisfied with President Trump, whether for the Iran war, for example. That by no means suggests that those people are going to vote Democrat when it comes down to it. I think the best case scenario for the Democrats in a lot of that situation is that some of those people who are less enthused than they were before, they just sit this one out and don't vote.
Right.
I mean, we're going back to that enthusiasm gap. I mean, if some Republicans are dissatisfied and just don't head out for the midterms, and then down the line for the election, and a lot of Democrats feel that they really, really need to, that's a huge problem for the Republican Party. That enthusiasm gap, again, I think is really challenging, because it's not insignificant, the numbers. I mean, a 20-point difference is high.
President Trump is a formidable campaigner. Like, when he's on the campaign trail and he's focused on that, his close advisors would say, as you all know, that he almost gets this energy from those raucous crowds of his supporters. He's not on the ballot this year. That's a great point, Bernie. Republicans do a lot better when he is on the ballot. But I think that towards, again, Iran war being the major hurdle here, but later in the summer, perhaps you will see the president more rallying and campaigning, barnstorming in some of these battleground districts and states. And I think that's a really strong point about Democrats, because even though Democrats are have this this momentum right now, and they're predicted to take back at least the House, the Senate is in play.
Well, it's something we're seeing not just in the U.S., but also around the world. But,
Yes.
it's going to be something for all of us to keep watching in the weeks ahead. That's all we have time for. But Finn, so good to have you back on. Thank you so much for being here. It's been great to see you both.
I love this podcast. It's my favorite podcast. I always love joining. Thank you for having me on.
And you're always welcome, Finn. So please come back soon.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. So please do leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.